Hello, this is John Kane, and I welcome you to Let's Talk on this Saturday, July 6th. While this program may not provide a path to spiritual enlightenment, we do encourage and in some cases start conversations. We don't do prayers or buffalo speeches. We take a tough look at history, oppression, survival. We talk about culture, the arts, politics, identity, history. And we may step on a few toes along the way, but our real goal here is to bring people together by breaking down what separates us. We will take on the false narratives and provide critical thinking to all that is heaped upon us. And we do it all right here from the Cattaraugus territory of the Seneca Nation. So let's talk Native. But before, let me remind people that you can check out our audio streaming at our website, which is www.letstalknative.com. Of course, we stream video of the show on Facebook Live. We take our video and we post it up on our YouTube channel, which is Let's Talk Native TV. We take the audio of our show and we put it up on SoundCloud, which makes it not only available on the SoundCloud app, but it also puts it out as a podcast on all of your favorite podcast platforms. So I encourage people to check out our show live, check out our show after the fact, and share it and offer your comments. I've got Ed Schindler in studio today, and I want to pick up a conversation that I started on my show in New York a couple of days ago on the 4th of July. And my show there, because it was the 4th of July, I felt like it was really necessary to delve into the reasons, the real reasons for the white colonists for waging a war against their motherland, waging a war against England. Why they felt so compelled to declare their independence? Because we've been fed a line of bullshit for many, many years on this, and I think it's time that we set some of the record straight on this thing. So that's what Ed Schindler and I are going to talk about a little bit. I think there is, just like with the Civil War. Civil War, there's a whole lot of deniers out there who want to claim that the Civil War had nothing to do with slavery. Of course, it had to do with slavery. Slavery was becoming problematic. That much of the world was already moving away from this idea of enslaving a specific race of people, and the South didn't want any part of it. I mean, slavery was the reason for the Civil War, and it wasn't so much that the North was that much against slavery. They just knew that they couldn't allow the South to secede with this growing movement to end slavery. So, but the same can be said for this War of Independence, and I also think it's wrong to call it a revolutionary war. I mean, Ed, we were talking about this before we got started here. Russia had a revolution. France had a revolution. Yeah. Great Britain didn't have a revolution. The United States didn't even exist. It was a war of independence. It wasn't a revolution. They didn't change the British government. They didn't topple the monarchy. These were a bunch of rich white people living, in these 13 colonies who wanted to further enrich themselves. So my show in New York, what I did is I literally went through many of the 27 charges that Jefferson listed in the Declaration of Independence against King George of England. And I don't need to go through all of them because many of them are pretty benign. I mean, think about this. Think about the reasons, how much of a justification you would have to have for these these Englishmen to wage a war against their fellow countrymen from across the sea. Do you honestly think it was about taxation? You think that these colonists were going to wage a war against England over taxation? I mean, because that's the line of crap that we're sold, right? That's one of the things we're always told, right, all the way back to elementary school, is that the reasons for the Revolutionary War was about taxation without representation. Look, I hate to remind anybody, but most of Europe was operating as a monarchy. Your king or your queen wasn't an elected representative, but you know what? That's the system that you came from. So the idea that this colonial aristocracy had grown in their lust to further enrich themselves no longer wanted the constraints of the monarchy on what they were doing in the colonies. And so what were the constraints they were worried about? Well, we know that that King George had issued the Royal Proclamation of 1763, and that Royal Proclamation basically put a real high standard for any increase in land appropriation from native territories. Look, Great Britain had been battling France, at home, in Europe, and in North America. They were very grateful for the support they got from many of their native allies, not the least of which were the Haudenosaunee, and they wanted to make sure that these native people who they had encouraged to kill other white men, albeit French, weren't going to be incited to turn on them or on their countrymen in these colonies. So the Royal Proclamation was essentially a line that Great Britain, the king, had issued and said, "Look, we don't want any more expansion, at least for the time being." He did not want a problem with native people. He didn't want the Haudenosaunee or the Iroquois, as they knew us, to form any other unions with any of the other with the Shawnee or anybody else, Tecumseh and company. Didn't want any other allegiances to be bound between native people who may see the handwriting on the wall. Now, don't get me wrong, the King of England was absolutely committed to this idea that he would ultimately subjugate native people under the crown, under the throne of England. But he didn't want to try to. It wasn't in his design to launch full scale war against native people, and especially understanding that there was no monolithic native person. There was there were hundreds, maybe even 1,000 or so distinct native peoples living in North America, and that's just not the battle that the King of England wanted to have. But you know what? The colonists, they were just enamored with this idea that there was an unlimited amount of land that they could claim for themselves. They knew what land was to them. Land was a commodity that could make them rich. So not only did they want free land, they obviously felt very strongly about free labor and slavery. And I would argue that for all the other reasons that you were taught, little kiddies in school, about why there was this Revolutionary War, this War of Independence, most of it was a lie. The real reason that the Revolutionary War was fought was because the rich white men of these colonies wanted to enrich themselves, and they knew that enriching themselves meant pushing back, taking more land from native people. In fact, one of the complaints, I mean, in case most of you probably never read the Declaration of Independence. It's before the absurdity of a white man, a rich white man, who owned slaves, and actually one of the slaves he actually had transformed into a sex slave. So he owned and raped slaves. Thomas Jefferson, yes. Look, you can't say that a slave consents to have sex with their master. That's not consent. If a white man says he owns you, and you are bound by his orders, or literally bound by chains, you're not exactly consenting to a love affair with Thomas Jefferson. So sorry, he was a rapist and he was a slaveholder. And the irony of this guy writing words like, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." You know what? Thomas Jefferson, if you really believe that, then let's be clear. You may believe that all men were created equal, but after creation, that equality was going to be stripped away. It was going to be stripped away in genocide, and it was going to be stripped away in slavery. So all men may have been endowed by the Creator with certain unalienable rights, but white men were going to make sure that those rights did not remain unalienable. In fact, that's what exactly they were going to alienate people of color from any rights that they may have been endowed by their Creator, and I don't think there's any way to characterize that any other way.
If you read that carefully, he said that all men are created equal. He didn't he didn't recognize Native Americans nor black slaves. He didn't recognize them as being people. Okay? And he didn't name women. Women weren't recognized as having those rights.
Well, and they could claim, and this is what they always say. Well, by men they mean man, as in mankind.
Yes.
And there's some debate on whether these white men believed Native people were truly human or black people were truly human, but they clearly did, because you don't wage war against animals. You know what I'm saying? You don't pass laws that you expect animals to. And that's one of the things that Thomas Jefferson says in his, or not Thomas Jefferson, I'm sorry, Frederick Douglass, in his speech that he gave in Rochester, New York, 1851. He said, to a slave, what is the 4th of July? And he goes on to say, don't tell me that I've got to convince you that black people were human beings. You can't pass laws regulating animals. You knew that they were human beings. So, I mean, they knew we were human beings. But the fact of the matter is, it is telling what he says. He says that all men are created equal. He didn't say all men are equal.
No.
He didn't say that they remained equal. He said they were created that way, and then we fixed it. Then we white people, we went and fixed it. But so there's that absurdity that Thomas Jefferson, slaveholder, a guy who actually talked about exterminating Native people, not just removing people. I mean, just in case you're not familiar with it, I mean, he actually talked about a full-scale extermination of Native people if they did not comply with complete subjugation. But in the 27 charges that Thomas Jefferson lays against the king of England, this is one of them. This is the 7th one. He says, he's saying this of the king. He says, he has endeavored to prevent the population of these states, for that purpose obstructing the laws for naturalization of foreigners, refusing to pass others to encourage their migration hither, and raising the conditions of new appropriation of land. So let's be clear what he's saying here. He's saying that the King of England, and this is almost directly in response to the Royal Proclamation of 1763. He said the King of England was not allowing more Europeans, more Englishmen, to come to the colonies. He wouldn't allow a population explosion in the colonies. He was limiting it. That's what Jefferson is getting. So not only was he obstructing laws for more naturalization of foreigners, but he was refusing to pass others to encourage their migration, and also that he was raising the conditions for appropriation of new lands. So where do you think these new lands came from? So one of the complaints that he clearly states here is he was not only that the King of England was not allowing us to build and to explode the population of these colonies, and he was not allowing us to expand these colonies deeper into Indian country. That's what Thomas Jefferson was saying in this complaint. And many of the complaints that he's making about, even the taxation without representation thing. I mean, what you're led to believe as a child is that the King of England was raping these colonies of all this wealth, that he was enriching himself with all of this money coming from the colonies. You know who was enriching themselves? The colonial aristocracy. Jefferson, Adams, these guys, Franklin, these guys were all wealthy men. They would become wealthy. George Washington. You know how George Washington made his money? Land speculation, appropriation of lands. He was a surveyor. What do you think he was surveying? He wasn't, he wasn't canvassing the stars here. He was drawing line. He was making maps and laying claims to land. So clearly, one of the things that Jefferson was trying to charge the king was limiting their ability to expand the colonial land base. And again, the taxation without representation. Much of the taxes that the king was putting on these colonies was going to pay for the border security, the frontier security. The King of England was charging taxes and then was paying these so-called militias to prevent conflicts at the frontier. The problem is many of these militias were double dealing. They were taking money and then violating the law and said, "No, we're still gonna we're gonna take money and we're gonna take land at the same time." Their jobs were to prevent some of this. So if you look at the real history, not just these 27 charges that Jefferson puts out there, but if you go back and you look at real history, what you're gonna find out is that these wealthy white men were pissed that the King of England would not allow them to expand farther into Indian country. In fact, so what's the last charge? The last charge that they make against the king. So 27 charges. The final charge they make is that he has excited domestic insurrection amongst us, and has endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers the merciless Indian savages, whose known rule of warfare is an undistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions. So, if you didn't think this was about Native people before, he was claiming, again, Jefferson and all those other guys who signed this document were insisting that the King of England was siding with Native people, and that he was getting Native people on their side to fight against, to bring war and ravaging against these colonies. And it doesn't take much research to find out where were the worst atrocities committed in this relationship between Native people and the colonists. Well, in 1872, a few years after this Declaration of Independence, there was an event that took place just over what you would consider the Pennsylvania-Ohio border, and at least the modern border, in an area that was called Gunnedenhutton. And there was a massacre that was known as the Gunnedenhutton Massacre, or the Moravian Massacre. Now, the Native people, and there was about 100 of them that lived there, they were devout Christians, Moravians. I mean, this is a kind of a devoted, denomination of Christianity, and they were living in an area. They were kind of chased out of their community, but then ventured back to try to grab some of their, harvest some of the crops that they already planted because they were starving. So they went back. About 100 of them went back to this to the Moravian villages, and they were rounded up by the Pennsylvania colonial militia, the Americans, the American militia. And this American militia, look, these guys were pacifists. They hadn't taken a side against the colonists, or they weren't rooting for one side or the other. But this Pennsylvania militia decided, they voted. A militia now. They voted, and their vote was to kill them all. So what they did is they separated the women and children from the men, put them in two separate buildings, and then they tied them all up. They told them that they were going to die. These praying Indians went into these two separate, and they prayed. And so as they're on their knees praying, this militia went in, bound them, tied them all up, then clubbed them with mallets on the head, and then killed them by scalping them. Now, after they left their bloody corpses laying on the floor, then they burned the two buildings that they were in. So they bound them, they beat them, they bludgeoned them, and then they scalped them, and then they burnt their corpses in two of their own buildings. So, in case you were wondering about this whole idea of an undistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions, 28 of those who were killed were men, 29 were women, and 39 were children. We could argue that it was probably more than 39 that were children, because probably some of the older children were being listed as men and women, not as children. But even in the assessment done at that time, 28 men, including old men, 29 women, and 39 children were murdered by the colonists. So when Thomas Jefferson says that the king has excited domestic insurrection amongst us and has endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers the merciless Indian savages, the merciless savages were not the Native people. And look, these guys, these Moravians, these Lenape, who were in these devoted Christians, they were, again, you can't be missed. They were Christians, so they weren't even these heathens or pagans or these infidels. They were practicing Christians, and they were still. And do you think that Christianity saved them? Do you think, the fact that they shared the same faith as these white men? No, it didn't save them. They were murdered, and you can't even say they were murdered like dogs. I mean, they were. It was more like the way baby seals are bludgeoned. No, you bludgeon them in the head, and then you remove their hair. That's what happened. And look, it'd be great if we could say, well, that's just one example. Look, this is the easy one to find. This is the one you can look it up yourself. So, so I cite both those two of the 27 charges. The one that that Jefferson claims the king, was preventing them from appropriating more native lands, and the charge that he makes that he was inciting these native people to commit these atrocities against their colonists. But if you go through all 27 charges, and most of them are crazy. They're BS. It's like they wouldn't honor our laws that we're passing. Yeah, because you weren't honoring the laws that the monarchy was passing. I mean, they talked about, they weren't getting jury trials. Well, we don't get jury trials of our peers either. I mean, almost every charge that Jefferson makes against the King of England, the colonies were guilty of the same things, not just at the time, but would ultimately, they'd be responsible for these same crimes right up till today. They would not let trade. They interfered for cutting off our trade with all parts of the world. Look, I talked about this just the last show. New York State and the federal government won't. They are fining and locking up and seizing product, even as we trade native manufactured goods from one native territory to another. So, if that was the justification for waging a war, well, I better load my gun then. I mean, they go on to say that they were imposing taxes without consent. Yeah, we have a little of that going on here too. We've got the state of New York believes that they have the right to tax the sales that we make on our territories if we make them to if you're in Seneca territory, they're saying only the Seneca sales are non-taxable. I mean, that's what they try to say. I mean, I'm not saying they're enforcing it, but once we take a product and we leave this territory and go to another territory, they're enforcing it. That's the Eric White case that that we're concerned about. But you go through this whole thing. They talked about having a standing army, and that they let's see, what are the for quartering large bodies of armed troops among us. Well, what the hell do you think the whole reservation system was? Every one of those reservations was a military installation. They had armed troops. That's exactly what the colonists did. And then I love this one. So the 14th charge was for quartering large bodies of armed troops among us. Then the next one says for protecting them by a mock trial from punishment for any murders which they should commit on their inhabitants of these states. Look, the United States not only has mock trials for their military as they commit murder all throughout the entire world. I mean, do you know how many of these, even these contracted mercenaries, how many of them been charged or ruled guilty of murder? None of them. They're killing women and children all over the freaking world and not being charged. I mean, the abuses these children at the border are going through, nobody's being charged. Missing and murdered Indigenous women. The reason that this report that was done on the Canadian side called the missing and murdered Indigenous women issue an act of genocide, because I had to think about this thing, and I had some debate. In fact, Laura Coogee, we talked about it on my show in New York. I was troubled with the use of genocide, but here's the reason. Here's the logic. It isn't just that the Canadian government and the U.S. government turn a blind eye to these murders and these kidnappings and the sex slave trade and all that stuff, and it isn't just that they're somewhat complicit. Look, many of these, it turns out many of the women who turn missing are turning up missing at the hands of police, RCMP, provincial authorities. Any number, same thing on the U.S. side. You ever hear these, what they call, I want to call them twilight or midnight or, there's an expression they use for when they would take these guys and they would drive them miles away from and then drop them off. There was an expression for it. I don't know if it'll come to me, but they call them like these midnight cruises or something like that. And some of these guys would freeze to death trying to walk home because we're talking about North Dakota. Look, the United States is known for mock trials of police. That's what the Black Lives Matter issue is over. The fact that these cops never held accountable. They choked to death Eric Garner. Not only did the guy who choked him not get charged or suffer any punishment, all 5 of the cops that were kneeling on him and assisting in this murder, none of them got in any trouble. Oh, they paid off the family a little bit. But these are, the mock trials that Jefferson is accusing the King of England for conducting. That's the history of the United States. Mock trials every time people of color are abused. Look, it's at some point, if you look at the lynchings that took place, how many people do you think were ever charged with lynching a black man? None. The death and destruction that took place at the Tulsa riots, or any of the other black communities that were destroyed or Native, nobody ever stood trial for the Sand Creek Massacre or the Wounded Knee Massacre. Nobody stands trial for this. Don't tell me about mock trials. You guys are the most famous for mock trials. All right, hey, we're at the bottom of this hour of this show, so we'll take a break. We'll come back, but I want to. We're going to discuss this. Because I think people just don't understand that all of this rhetoric, and people will hold up this Declaration of Independence as this immortal, just revered document, and most of it's crap. Most of it is an outright lie or just plain hypocrisy. We'll talk more about it when we come back. This is John Kane with Ed Schindler. This is Let's Talk Native. We'll be right back. Thanks.
One of the other things.
Back in Spain 500 years ago, old Chris Columbus lived. Told Isabella that the world was round. She thought he'd flipped his lid. He bugged the queen so much she finally said, okay, I'll give you 3 ships and some men. He said, I'll find a brand new route to India. I soon be home again. In 1492, who found who? 1492,
right, thanks for coming back. This is John Kane with Ed Schindler. Look, I want to thank our sponsors. I want to thank Eric White and ERW Enterprises, Ross and Holly John, and the folks at RJE, Ross John Enterprises. And I've got another sponsor that kind of lays in the wings, but it's those three that provide consistent support. Look, I don't have, I'm not on anybody's payroll here. I'm fortunate to have those three provide support on a weekly or monthly basis that allow us to do what we do here. And look, I've got to say it. I mention this all the time. I know some of the things that I say here, people don't necessarily agree with. I am not espousing the widely held views of things. When I start telling people that the Revolutionary War was fought over stealing native lands, you may have not ever heard anybody tell you that before. And you don't have to necessarily take my word for it, but do some research. Before you dismiss what I say, at least consider it. I mean, first off, read the Declaration of Independence and look at the irony, and I won't even put it as the hypocrisy of this thing. Again, can't get past the idea that you've got a slave-holding, slave-raping white man, wealthy white man, suggesting that all men are created equal and that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among them were life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Well, he was talking about white people. White men, and Ed is correct. Look, you can go through the Declaration of Independence. You can go through the Articles of Confederation, the U.S. Constitution. They don't mention women in there, and to the extent that Native people are mentioned, we are always mentioned as something outside of them, different, separate. We are not a part of them. Now, guys like Mark Charles suggest that we should be part of We the People. Well, I'm saying no, we shouldn't. But let's not pretend that we were included, because we weren't. And in fact, I'm comfortable with that. But the people who were subjugated by this, because we weren't. We were not subjugated by these documents. We were characterized, but we weren't subjugated. Black men were. I mean, in the U.S. Constitution, black men were listed as 3/5 of a man. They weren't even. So they were still considered men. Ed, right? I mean, they were still considered men, but they weren't going to be afforded the rights of a full man. We're going to say, we're going to consider you 3/5 of a man. And to be clear, this 3/5 thing was a numbers game to empower the South with not only more of a population that they could utilize to justify representation. It was about apportionment of congressmen and the apportionment of taxes.
That was gerrymandering of that time.
Well, and this is where the Electoral College comes from. All of this was about making sure that the slaveholding states would actually have a disproportionate amount of representation, power, money, for their free population. Now, they would include, black men as 3/5 of a man because they had, oftentimes you'd have a plantation that would have very few white people, but a whole lot of black people living there. And now, they didn't want to count them as full men because then they would actually have to consider them, free citizens. No, they only wanted their population counted for the purposes of money and power. So, look, we're not a part of that stuff. But I think it's, if you don't subscribe to some of the things that I'm suggesting here, I'm saying do your own research. I'm putting this stuff out there. I'm making my case for my interpretation of not only the Declaration of Independence, but the facts that were out there. I mean, the colonists. I mean, not all native territories were involved in a sophisticated level of trade with other countries, but we all had plenty of trade amongst ourselves. But there were a few. The Cherokee, for instance. The Cherokee were actually engaged in full-scale trade with Haiti, with some of the islands of the Caribbean. Yeah. And the first thing that the colonists did was stop that. So the very claim they make that the King of England was interfering with their trade with other countries or throughout the world is exactly what the colonists did immediately. Now, they also began immediately affecting the trade that Native people would have with each other. And to be clear, when they drafted their Constitution, one of the mentions of Native people, which has been grossly misinterpreted and characterized, is the Commerce Clause of the U.S. Constitution. And in the Commerce Clause of the Constitution, it says that Congress shall have the power to regulate commerce in and among several states with foreign nations and with Indian tribes. That's the language they use. Not of Indians, with Indians. And yet, the Supreme Courts have held that that clause gave plenary powers. You know what plenary means? It means absolute power. It gave Congress absolute power over Indians. That's one of the complaints that Thomas Jefferson makes of the king. He's saying the king was asserting absolute power and tyranny over the inhabitants of these states, these colonies. Well, you've had your courts, and once the courts made that ruling, based on this gross misinterpretation of the Commerce Clause, once they made that ruling, they said, well, Congress has plenary powers over, and they have the right to regulate the metes and bounds of native sovereignty. Yeah, that's what your court said. And you know what? It's bullshit. It's simply not true. It doesn't say that Congress, according to your Constitution, had the power to regulate the commerce of native people. It says the commerce with. So they could regulate what their own people did in terms of trade. It never says anything that they could regulate our trade internationally with the Cherokee trading with Haiti, for instance. It never said that they had the authority under their Constitution to regulate the trade that we would have amongst ourselves. Congress had the power to regulate commerce in and amongst several states with foreign nations and with Indian tribes. That's all the Commerce Clause says. But getting back to what predates that Constitution, it is so clear, and anybody who takes the time to do some research, they will learn that one of the driving forces to these white men, rich, wealthy white men, the ones who signed this ridiculous document, was that they wanted to further enrich themselves. I mean, what do you think? I mean, you know what George Washington was paying his commissioned officers with? A promise of Indian land. Yeah, I mean, we still today will see that there are they call them military tracts. George Washington was double dealing native people. On one hand, he was trying to promise, "Oh no, your lands are secure." As he was telling native people, telling his representatives to tell native people that, he was telling his officers, you know, while you're doing your battle here, you look at the lands that you're going to be rewarded with, and they were. You know, make no mistake about it. Everything, all the tyranny that Jefferson claimed the king was guilty of, and I'm not saying that the claims were wrong. My argument is everything that he accused the king of doing, they were doing and would do right up till today. Today, the United States still cannot reconcile the fact that we don't accept, some of us don't. Look, again, not pretending to speak for all Native people. Many of you, look, I saw you guys putting out your flags for Independence Day. I saw some of you. I saw your lighted banners and everything else. I see it. I get it. I know how patriotic some of you are. I know how you guys, sign up to fight in the, for the U.S. military. Yeah, look, you're proud to vote for your, for your own oppressors, agents. Vote for your own agents of oppression. Look, I get it, but not all of us do. And we had generations of Native people who rejected this subjugation to the United States. 1924, when the United States passes the Citizenship Act, our people didn't accept that. The Haudenosaunee didn't accept that. We seem pretty accepting of it now, but the first time draft notices, Ed, what did the Six Nations do when draft notices got sent out for World War II?
Signed up. And the ones that wanted to not sign up,
but if you recall, I mean, the chiefs, remember they went to Washington? They said,
Yes.
well, we need to declare war separately.
yes.
So the chiefs went down to Washington and they made their own declaration of war against the Axis powers. So they could justify it. No, you didn't know. You didn't know this. Oh, you gotta look this up. No, there's pictures. You can find that a lot. You got the computer for it. Yeah, you gotta look this up. It's beautiful. If you find it, maybe you can throw it on the screen here. There's pictures of our chiefs going to Washington to sign a declaration of war against the Axis powers. That's the way they could justify more justify, I guess, our people participating in that war. But there was direct opposition to the idea of forced enlistment. There was direct opposition. And today, there still is opposition. I mean, look, right now, all 18-year-olds are supposed to register for the draft. Many people don't. Many people aren't willing to register for the draft. And look, there's some consequences for not doing it, but we have never accepted this forced conscription, as they call it. But again, I know there's people enlist in the armed forces at a higher rate proportionally than any other group of people, any other distinct group of people in North America. So I know when I say and I put these challenges out there, these historical challenges, I'm not doing this based on something I dreamt up. Even the Second Amendment, and you've got Roxanne's book there. Hold it up here. This is Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz. She joined me in New York for my show when I was talking about this issue. She talks about the Second Amendment, and she makes it very clear. Look, they didn't need to grant the right to keep arms in the Constitution. They didn't need to do it. That right already existed. The reason for the Second Amendment was to encourage more and more people to have guns for two reasons: slave patrols and fighting off hostile Indians. Now, why do you think Native people would have been hostile? I know the assumption could be is that we were just somehow evil creatures, I guess. No, the reason that Native people were hostile was because of land theft. I mean, even when we leased land, what would end up happening is white people would say, "No, we're not going to pay you." And then we would not have any means for enforcing any the breach of the lease. It's a funny thing. You mentioned the Canandaigua Treaty.
Mm-hmm.
Article 7 of the Canandaigua Treaty is a provision that basically tries to keep peace. George Washington's men wrote this up. They didn't want our people retaliating for the crimes that white men would commit against our people. I mean, that was the real reason for Article 7 of the Canandaigua Treaty. They didn't want us to retaliate. So they come up with an equitable provision. And what they said is, look, if a white man commits a crime against a Native people, you will petition the President of the United States or his assignees, and they will make sure that justice is served for that violation. Now, reciprocating, if a Native person committed a crime, it was upon the white men to petition the chiefs or assignees to make sure that we properly dealt justice with a violation that we would commit. But it wasn't about us violating white people. This was about their concern. And again, it says very, very clearly, lest we keep the peace. That's what it was. The whole provision was about keeping peace between the Haudenosaunee and the Americans, because the whole Revolutionary War, this War of Independence, was based on. It was based on these colonies wanting to take more from Native people, so they had to figure out, well, how can we try to maintain some peace? And so, what's the language in the Canandaigua Treaty? It says the United States recognize that our land is ours, and they will never claim the same, nor will they disturb us in the free use and enjoyment of of those lands, or our friends and allies who live amongst us. And it's mentioned three times in the Canandaigua Treaty. There's a full acknowledgement. All that doctrine of discovery stuff, that Justice John Marshall would codify into law 30 years later never takes into account the fact that there was already language signed by the representatives of the president acknowledging that we not only could we own land, that we had the legal right to own land, but that we did own the land. I mean, the crazy part, I always talk about John Marshall. He when he equated this notion of discovery to be the same as conquest, he called it an extravagant pretension. He says, however extravagant the pretension is to convert an inhabited country into a conquered country, however extravagant it is, if we can make that claim in the first instance and sustain it, it becomes law and it cannot be challenged. Well, the problem with that is they didn't make it in the first instance. 30 years before Marshall would even make this ridiculous, absurd, extravagant, pretentious claim, you had the President of the United States writing up documents acknowledging that we owned our land. So, I mean, again, the hypocrisy and the inconsistency, the contradictions of law, the contradictions of policy, and again, the outright hypocrisy. When you read, and look, I encourage, it's not a very long document, the Declaration of Independence. I mean, it really isn't. I encourage people to read it because you can't read it and not see what BS the whole thing really is, especially when you get into the 27 complaints that Jefferson makes against the King of England. Keep in mind that they did this with the intent to kill their blood relatives, their countrymen. So, I mean, you have to think about when they say let the facts be submitted to a candid world, their justification, not just for claiming independence, but to kill for it. That's what you have to keep in mind, that they were prepared to kill for. And, you know, the other one, the Boston Tea Party.
Yes.
I mean, do you know what gets lost in all of that? There's, you know, and we hear, and they almost make it sound like those people were mockingly dressed as Native people. They weren't really trying to disguise themselves as Native people. They were trying to cover up their own identity as they were throwing this tea in off the it was being a tax protest. But the reason that they dressed as Native people was because they were trying to fly that in the face of England, because they felt like England was siding with Native people. So they said, well, we'll give you your Indians. So they dressed up as I was told they were dressed as Mohawks. I don't know if it was that specific. No. But they dressed up as Native people, went on to boarded these ships, pushed away the guards, and threw this taxable product and ruined a bunch of taxable product. But the whole idea of dressing as Native people was, again, another example of how much those people hated Native people. And they hated the fact that Great Britain was at least giving some level of consideration to trying to maintain peace with Native people.
Boston Tea Party was a framing job. That's basically all that it was, is they framed the Native people in order to destroy any agreement between England and the natives.
Well, and I don't even know if they were legitimately trying to pass off that Native people were doing. Native people had no reason to throw this stuff overboard. But I think the whole idea was to put on this vulgar display, and obviously it was a protest. This wasn't, it wasn't, enough money to have broken anybody's treasury or anything else. But they did this demonstration. They dressed up as Native people, not just to cast blame on Native people, but to make it fly in the face of England, who in their, again, and it's you can read it in the Declaration of Independence, and if you look at any of the notations, any of the correspondences that were taking place during this time, it is so clear that especially in the southern states, but not only in the southern states, that so many of them were hating the idea that they could not just go in and steal all this native land, and especially since you saw that Native people were productive, that we not only we weren't living a subsistence existence, we were thriving in our lands, that we know how to plant, We knew how to feed ourselves and how to maintain order without their rigid hierarchies of kings and queens and guards and soldiers and jails and courts and all that stuff. They knew all. We knew how to do that stuff without any of their bureaucracy. So they were hell bent on. They were so bent on violating us that they were willing to kill their fellow white men to do it. And look, if you think I'm wrong, then prove me wrong. Then and I accept the challenge, and we can have this debate. But I don't think you can make a solid case to suggest that the anger that the colonists had towards the king was not somehow related to the royal proclamation of 1763 and the fact that the king was trying to maintain, not only maintaining peace with Native people, but was so committed to maintaining peace with Native people that he didn't want to see a mass appropriation of native lands that could have resulted in bloodshed.
Then there's also the Supreme Court of the U.S. ruled that the Cherokees owned their land, and the President of the U.S. said, "Let's see you enforce it," and he sent in troops and caused Cherokees to be relocated to Oklahoma.
Well, that was the Jackson administration, and
Yes.
what Jackson basically, he was actually the only president to actually defy a ruling. And this was a Cherokee case, and it was one where, in spite of Johnson's rulings on doctrine of discovery and everything else, he did attempt to right some of that wrong. And in I think it was Worcester versus Cherokee or something like that, he ruled in favor of the Cherokee, and Jackson said, "Well, you've got your ruling, now let's see you enforce it." He goes, "I've got the army." And so Jackson absolutely violated. But even going before, I mean, I got to get back to Thomas Jefferson. Now, one of the things that Jefferson also did, and I've talked about this letter that he wrote to the governor of Indiana, I think it was, Harrison. And basically what he said, he was encouraging white people to trade with Native people. He said, it is important that we seek out those Native people who are willing to conduct trade, and that we offer them lines of credit. He says it is important to run them into debt, because when they get this debt, and a debt they can't handle, they'll lop off that debt with their land. And once they start lopping off their that debt with their land, we will have them he called them circumscribed. We'll have them surrounded. And Native people will be forced to do one of two things. If they want to maintain their distinction, then they're going to have to leave. They won't be able to live amongst us and maintain this Native identity. So they can either stay here and conform and assimilate, or they can move. We'll move them west of the Mississippi. And you know what he said? He said, and if they should raise their hatchet, raise their tomahawk, we'll crush them. We'll exterminate them. We'll exterminate every last one of them. That's Thomas Jefferson. He was considered the enlightened one. He says, no, we're going to exterminate them. If they dare to resist and he actually called it our final solution. That sounds like, Nazi stuff, right? The final solution. And he goes, and if they resist our final resolution to the Indian problem, which is either to convert them and assimilate them, or move them the hell out of our way. I mean, this is Thomas Jefferson, the same one who wrote the Declaration of Independence. You think this wasn't a change of heart? This was right from the very, very start. I think the idea that we, as Native people, have bought this BS that they sold us. And like I said, I'm sorry, I saw the flags waving, on Thursday. Right here on Cattaraugus. I saw the red, white, and blue, signs, and put out in the yards. I mean, geez, give me a freaking break.
And Thomas Jefferson was the president that did the Louisiana Purchase and took all the land that he could, even west of the Mississippi.
Well, I mean, and to be clear, the Louisiana Purchase, which is just this outright fraud anyway. Yes. It is land that Spain claimed. They sold their discovery title to France, and then France sells it to the Americans, the United States. When Jefferson was selling this idea, especially to the southern states, you know how he sold it? He said, "This is where we're going to move the Indians to." Part of the reason for buying this discovery title to the Louisiana Purchase was because it was the absolute plan. Everybody associates Jackson with the Removal Act, but the idea of removing Native people started with Jefferson, right? I mean, right from the start. And his Louisiana Purchase, the entire reason, and they don't teach you this to anybody in history class either. The entire reason for the Louisiana Purchase was not just for land speculation in the future. It was to immediately provide a place that they could remove Native people to. That's what it was all about. Anyway, so I encourage people, look, if you don't agree with what I've talked about here, and look, and I don't make any apologies for covering this issue again after dealing with it with my New York show. Mm-hmm. I just think it's important enough that people need to understand what true history is. And look, and I heard somebody posted, instead of complaining about the past, we should be concerned about what we're doing in the future. Look, here's the problem: if we don't highlight and teach the real truth of history, then we will be ignorant to it, and we will allow the same things to happen over and over and over again. The only way you can prevent these kinds of injustices from happening time and time again, and again, we've got to point out that missing and murdered Indigenous women has a direct line back to this Declaration of Independence. The fact that Eric White is being fined $1.3 million. How do you not recognize the fact that you've got Thomas Jefferson complaining that the King of England was interfering with their trade? We can't just pretend that what we're up against now is just somehow an anomaly based on them not understanding that we still have this fantasy that we're somehow distinct. No, we're saying that we are distinct. And it has been the design of the United States to cut our throats from day one. And that's not just a complaint. That's just about characterizing history accurately. All right, I want to thank you guys for listening. We're pretty much out of time. We'll post this up on as a podcast, and you'll get a chance to share it after the fact. And again, I appreciate all of you who share the show. My wife who shares the show on so many Facebook group pages, and I appreciate you guys listening. We'll talk soon. This is John Kane with Ed Schindler. This is Let's Talk Native. Nyawai.
Nyawai.